The night sky over occupied France erupted in orange flames. A thunderous explosion shattered the silence as another German ammunition depot vanished in a pillar of fire and smoke. In the command bunker 20 kilometers away, Wehrmacht officers stared at their maps in stunned disbelief. Red markers dotted the landscape like a disease, each one marking another sabotage supply line, another destroyed weapons cache, another crippling blow to their war machine. General Heinrich Stolpnagel slammed his fist on the oak table. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "Our security is absolute. Our patrols are doubled. Our intelligence networks span every village. Yet, night after night, the explosions continued. Rail lines twisted into useless metal sculptures. Fuel depots became infernos. Ammunition stores disappeared in blasts that could be heard for miles. What the German High Command couldn't fathom. What their rigid military minds refused to accept was that their most devastating enemies weren't elite commandos dropped from Allied planes. They weren't hardened male partisans hiding in mountain caves. They were women. Ordinary women who had become extraordinary warriors, moving through occupied Europe like ghosts, carrying death in their handbags and revolution in their hearts. This is the story of the invisible army that brought the Third Reich to its knees. One explosion at a time. The war came to Europe's women not as a distant thunderclap, but as jackboots on cobblestones outside their front doors. In the autumn of 1940, as German forces swept across the continent like a steel tide, millions of women watched their worlds collapse overnight. In France, housewives saw their husbands marched away to prisoner of war camps. In Poland, mothers clutched their children as entire neighborhoods were cordoned off and emptied. In the Soviet Union, young women working in textile factories suddenly found themselves assembling uniforms for the enemy. Marie Deboge had been a seamstress in Lyon before the occupation. She remembered the morning when German officers requisitioned her workshop, converting it into a uniform repair station for Wehrmacht soldiers. "They expected us to mend the clothes of men who had killed our brothers," she would later recall. "They thought we would simply bow our heads and obey." But as Mary sat at her sewing machine, carefully stitching torn fabric, a different kind of repair was taking place in her mind, the reconstruction of her own identity from victim to resistance fighter. Across occupied Europe, similar transformations were occurring in kitchens, schools, hospitals, and factories. Women who had never contemplated violence found themselves calculating the explosive potential of everyday materials. Teachers who had spent their careers nurturing young minds began nurturing thoughts of sabotage. Nurses who had devoted themselves to healing started planning ways to wound the occupying forces where it would hurt most. In the villages of Belarus, 18-year-old Yelena Mazanik watched German supply convoys roll past her family's farm with mechanical regularity. Each truck carried ammunition, fuel, and equipment to the Eastern Front. Each convoy represented another day the war would continue, another 1,000 Soviet soldiers who might die. But Yelena noticed something the German logistics officers had overlooked. The convoys followed predictable routes, stopped at predictable intervals, and relied on local women to provide food and basic services at their rest points. The seed of resistance had been planted. What came next would change everything. In the occupied territories, resistance began not with grand declarations or military strategies, but with whispers. Women developed their own underground railroad of information, passing messages through networks invisible to German intelligence. A baker's wife in Normandy would mention to her neighbor that she'd seen unusual troop movements. The neighbor, who cleaned offices in the local German headquarters, would confirm the intelligence and pass it along to her sister, who worked as a telephone operator. Within hours, coded messages were flowing through seemingly innocent conversations, creating a web of information that stretched across continents. Zoe de Lunens epitomized this invisible network. By day, she was simply another French widow struggling to survive under occupation, tending her small garden and caring for elderly neighbors. But by night, she transformed into one of the most effective intelligence operatives in the French resistance. A modest cottage became a way station for Allied airmen shot down over enemy territory. Her root cellar concealed weapons, explosives, and radio equipment. Her gentle demeanor masked a mind that could memorize German patrol schedules, supply convoy routes, and the locations of ammunition dumps with photographic precision. The Germans saw us as harmless, Zoe later explained. Middle-aged women posed no threat in their minds. We were invisible to them, which made us incredibly dangerous. This invisibility became the Resistance's greatest weapon. While the Gestapo hunted for male saboteurs in forests and mountains, women moved freely through checkpoints, their shopping baskets concealing plastic explosives, their baby carriages hiding detonators and timing devices in the factories of occupied Poland. Women like Anna Kowalski perfected the art of industrial sabotage. Anna worked in a weapons production facility that had been converted to serve the German war effort. Her job was to inspect artillery shells before they were shipped to the front lines. But Anna had learned to identify the precise components that would cause catastrophic failures. A tiny metal filing dropped into the wrong place could turn a German howitzer into a bomb that would kill its own crew. A carefully placed scratch on a shell casing could cause it to explode prematurely. Every defective shell I created, Anna remembered, was one less weapon pointed at my countrymen. The psychological warfare was equally devastating. German soldiers began to doubt their equipment, their supply lines, and their own security. Reports flowed back to Berlin, describing mysterious equipment failures, unexplained explosions, and the growing sense that the occupied territories were not as pacified as the maps suggested. As resistance networks solidified, women received increasingly sophisticated training in the deadly arts of sabotage. In the forests outside Moscow, Soviet partisan leaders established secret training camps where housewives learned to handle explosives with the precision of demolition experts. These women studied the vulnerabilities of German infrastructure, which railway bridges were most critical, which ammunition depots were most poorly guarded, which supply routes were most susceptible to disruption. The training was brutal and comprehensive. Women learned to fashion explosives from household chemicals, to set timers using children's alarm clocks, and to plant charges that would maximize psychological impact while minimizing the risk of civilian casualties. They studied German military procedures, memorized the layouts of enemy installations, and practiced moving through occupied territory without attracting suspicion. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to exploit the Germans' own prejudices against them. Nazi ideology portrayed women as naturally submissive, intellectually inferior, and incapable of complex tactical thinking. This systematic underestimation became the Resistance's secret weapon. German guards would carefully search male civilians but wave women through checkpoints with barely a glance. Military officers would discuss sensitive operations in front of cleaning ladies, assuming they were too simple to understand the implications. Supply depot commanders would employ local women as cooks and laundresses, never imagining that these same women were mapping every vulnerable point in their installations. Maria Volkonsky exemplified this exploitation of enemy assumptions. A former chemistry professor at Moscow University, Maria had been trapped behind German lines during the rapid advance of 1941. Rather than flee or hide, she volunteered to work as a cook in a German field headquarters. For 6 months, she served meals to Wehrmacht officers while mentally cataloging their weaknesses, habits, and security procedures. When she finally escaped back to Soviet lines, she carried with her detailed intelligence about German positions, supply schedules, and personnel that proved invaluable to partisan planners. They treated me like furniture, Maria recalled. They would plan operations, discuss troop movements, and reveal military secrets as if I weren't even in the room. Their arrogance made them careless, and their carelessness made them vulnerable. Asterisk. The moment had come to transform intelligence into action. Across occupied Europe, women who had spent months or years gathering information and honing their skills began to strike. The first major operation occurred on a frigid February night in 1942, when a team of French women infiltrated a German ammunition depot outside Calais. Led by a former schoolteacher named Simone Moreau, the 5-woman team had spent weeks studying the facility's security patterns, identifying the guards' weaknesses, and calculating the precise placement needed to maximize destruction. Moving like shadows through the industrial complex, the women planted their homemade explosives with methodical precision. Each charge was carefully positioned to create a chain reaction that would consume the entire facility. The timer mechanisms, crafted from alarm clocks and bicycle parts, were set to detonate simultaneously at 3:47, an exact moment when the guard shift would be changing and security would be momentarily relaxed. The explosion lit up the French countryside like an artificial dawn. Windows shattered 15 kilometers away. The shockwave was felt across the English Channel. Most importantly, 3 months' worth of artillery shells, small arms ammunition, and explosives destined for the Atlantic Wall fortifications vanished in a single catastrophic blast. German investigators combed through the wreckage for weeks, searching for clues about the perpetrators. They found evidence of sophisticated planning, precise timing, and intimate knowledge of the facility's layout. What they couldn't find was any trace of the elite commando team they assumed must have been responsible. The idea that 5 middle-aged French women had just dealt the Wehrmacht one of its most significant supply disruptions was literally unthinkable. Similar operations began erupting across the occupied territories. In Yugoslavia, partisan women led by Vida Tomzic developed techniques for derailing German supply trains using explosives hidden in milk jugs and vegetable baskets. Their attacks were so precisely timed the trains would derail at specific points where the wreckage would block rail traffic for days, while being difficult for German repair crews to reach. In Norway, resistance women working in German-controlled factories perfected the art of slow-motion sabotage. Rather than causing dramatic explosions that would trigger immediate crackdowns, they introduced subtle defects into equipment that would cause failures weeks or months later. Airplane engines would seize at crucial moments. Submarine periscopes would fog at depths where lives depended on clear vision. Tank transmissions would fail during combat operations when repairs were impossible. The cumulative effect was psychological as much as military. German forces began to doubt their own equipment, their supply lines, and their security. Paranoia spread through the ranks as soldiers realized that their most dangerous enemies might be the seemingly harmless women who served their food, cleaned their barracks, and mended their uniforms. But the German response was swift and merciless. As the sabotage campaign intensified, so did the Nazi regime's retaliations. Heinrich Himmler issued explicit orders that any civilian suspected of resistance activities should be subjected to enhanced interrogation, regardless of age or gender. The Gestapo, initially reluctant to believe that women could pose serious security threats, began targeting female civilians with unprecedented brutality. The torture chambers of occupied Europe filled with women whose only crime had been striking back at their oppressors. In the basement of Lyons École de Santé Militaire, Gestapo officer Klaus Barbie perfected techniques specifically designed to break female prisoners. Marie Dubois, the seamstress who had become a saboteur, endured weeks of interrogation that left her physically and emotionally shattered. Yet she revealed nothing, not the names of her fellow resistance members, not the locations of weapon caches, not the plans for future operations. They wanted me to betray my friends, Marie later testified. They promised me food, medical care, even freedom if I would just give them names. But I had seen what they did to the children in our village. I had watched them execute innocent people as reprisals for our actions. How could I trade the lives of heroes for my own comfort? The public executions began in earnest. German commanders, frustrated by their inability to identify and eliminate the sabotage networks, resorted to collective punishment. For every ammunition depot destroyed, 10 civilians would be shot. For every derailed train, an entire village would be burned. The Nazi logic was brutal, but simple. If they couldn't catch the saboteurs, they would make the cost of resistance so high that local populations would turn against their own freedom fighters. In the town square of Ardor-sur-Glane, 642 civilians, including 247 women and 205 children, were murdered in retaliation for resistance activities in the region. The SS herded the women and children into the local church, sealed the doors, and set the building ablaze. Those who tried to escape through the windows were machine-gunned. The men were shot in nearby barns. The entire village was then razed to ensure it could never again serve as a base for resistance operations. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming brutality, the women of the resistance continued their work. They understood that surrender would mean not just personal defeat, but the triumph of a system that viewed them as subhuman. Each act of sabotage became not just a military operation, but a declaration of human dignity in the face of industrial genocide. Yelena Mazanik, the Belarusian farm girl who had watched German convoys pass her family's land, exemplified this refusal to surrender. After her entire village was destroyed in a reprisal action, Yelena joined a partisan unit operating in the forests around Minsk. She specialized in anti-personnel operations, using her innocent appearance to get close to German officers before detonating concealed explosives. Her most famous operation involved infiltrating a German officer's celebration in September 1943, where she eliminated an entire command staff with a single, precisely placed bomb. They killed my family, Yelena explained years later. They burned my home, murdered my neighbors, destroyed everything I had ever loved. What did they expect? That I would simply forgive and forget? Every German officer I killed was justice for 100 innocent victims. By 1943, women-led sabotage operations had evolved from scattered acts of defiance into coordinated strategic campaigns. Soviet partisan commanders, initially skeptical of female operatives, began to recognize their unique advantages and incorporated them into major military operations. The Rail War campaign that disrupted German supply lines across the Eastern Front relied heavily on women who could move through enemy territory without arousing suspicion. French resistance networks, coordinating with Allied intelligence services, launched Operation Jericho, a systematic campaign to destroy German ammunition depots and fuel installations throughout occupied France. Women played central roles in reconnaissance, infiltration, and execution of these missions. Their success rate was remarkable. Over 200 major installations were destroyed or severely damaged, with fewer than 30 female operatives captured or killed. The German military establishment, forced to confront the reality of female-led resistance, began to adapt their security procedures. Women were subjected to more thorough searches at checkpoints. Female civilian workers were banned from sensitive military installations. Even cleaning ladies and cooks required special security clearances and constant supervision. But these adaptations came too late and proved largely ineffective. The resistance networks had already evolved beyond the Germans' ability to contain them. Women who had been trained as saboteurs began training others, creating a multiplying effect that spread faster than German security forces could track. Underground communication networks, once limited to simple message passing, became sophisticated intelligence operations capable of coordinating complex, multi-target strikes across hundreds of kilometers. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Soldiers who had been trained to view occupied populations as defeated and pacified now lived in constant fear of their own support staff. Every meal might be poisoned. Every uniform sent for cleaning might return with hidden explosives. Every local woman who smiled and nodded might be memorizing their security procedures for future use. WEHRM, ACHT morale reports from this period describe a pervasive sense of paranoia and vulnerability that significantly degraded combat effectiveness. Units spent increasing amounts of time and resources on security measures that should have been devoted to fighting the advancing Allied armies. The invisible war waged by women in the occupied territories had become a crucial factor in the broader military conflict. As Allied forces advanced across Europe in 1944, the women who had fought in the shadows began to emerge into the light. In village after village, town after town, the liberating soldiers were met by female resistance fighters who had maintained their operations right up until the moment of liberation. These women had preserved vital intelligence about German positions, booby traps, and remaining military assets. They had protected Allied airmen, hidden Jewish refugees, and maintained the spark of hope through the darkest years of occupation. Yet liberation brought its own form of tragedy. Many of the women who had risked everything for freedom found themselves marginalized in the post-war reconstruction. Male resistance leaders received decorations, pensions, and political positions. Women were thanked politely and expected to return to their domestic roles as if nothing had changed. The official histories being written barely mentioned their contributions. Military records classified their operations as auxiliary activities rather than combat operations. Simone Moreau, who had led the successful assault on the Calais ammunition depot, spent the post-war years working as a cleaning lady in a government office building. Despite her proven leadership abilities and intimate knowledge of resistance operations, she was considered unsuitable for positions in the new security services because of her gender. They wanted us to disappear again, she reflected bitterly. We were useful when they needed us to die for France. We became inconvenient when they needed to decide who deserved credit for saving France. The psychological wounds ran deeper than official neglect. Many of these women had seen and done things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had killed enemy soldiers at close range, watched friends die under torture, and made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. But unlike their male counterparts, they had no veterans organizations, no support networks, and no societal recognition of their trauma. Anna Kowalski, the Polish factory worker who had sabotaged German artillery shells, suffered from what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. For decades after the war, she would wake up screaming from nightmares about explosions, about the German soldiers who had died because of her sabotage, about the civilians who had been executed in retaliation for her actions. People think resistance was glorious, she said in one of her rare interviews. They don't understand the cost. Every life I saved by destroying German weapons was balanced by lives lost in reprisals. How do you calculate that mathematics? How do you sleep with those numbers in your head? Despite the official silence and personal struggles, the impact of women's resistance could not be completely erased. Declassified German military documents, released decades after the war, revealed the true extent of female-led sabotage operations and their strategic significance. Wehrmacht after-action reports described unprecedented supply disruption, caused by unidentified indigenous sabotage networks. GESTA PO files contained hundreds of profiles of suspected female operatives. Many of them had never been identified or apprehended. These documents painted a picture of a parallel war that had been fought, largely in secret. Conflict where the primary weapons were courage, intelligence, and the enemy's own assumptions about female capabilities. The statistical impact was staggering. Women-led operations had destroyed enough German ammunition to supply an entire army corps for 6 months, derailed over 3,000 supply trains, and eliminated hundreds of key personnel through precision assassination missions. More importantly, these operations had forced the German military to divert enormous resources to rear area security. Thousands of soldiers who should have been fighting at the front were instead guarding supply depots, escorting convoys, and investigating sabotage incidents. The psychological effect on German morale was incalculable, but clearly significant. The invincible Wehrmacht had been reduced to fearing middle-aged housewives and teenage seamstresses. Today, as historians continue to uncover the full scope of women's resistance during World War II, a clearer picture emerges of their crucial role in Allied victory. Museums across Europe now feature exhibits dedicated to female saboteurs and spies. Academic researchers have documented thousands of previously unknown operations led or executed by women. Governments have finally begun to award proper recognition to female veterans who had been overlooked for decades. Marie Dubois, the Lion seamstress who had endured Gestapo torture rather than betray her comrades, lived to see herself honored as a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor at age 89. Standing before the assembled crowd at the ceremony, she spoke for all the women who had fought in the shadows. We did not fight for glory or recognition. We fought because someone had to fight. We succeeded because they underestimated us. They saw weakness where there was strength, submission where there was rebellion, harmlessness where there was deadly purpose. The ammunition depots that burned across occupied Europe were more than military targets. They were beacons of defiance that announced to the world that the human spirit could not be conquered. The women who lit those fires, who planned those explosions, who risked everything to strike back at tyranny, proved that warfare's most devastating weapons are not always the largest or most sophisticated. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is simply the refusal to surrender. In the end, the German generals were right to be amazed. They had built what they believed was an impregnable empire, defended by the most advanced military machine in human history. They had conquered nations, enslaved populations, and imposed their will across an entire continent. But they had failed to account for the one force that no amount of military might could suppress: the determination of ordinary people to remain free. The women who burned the Nazi Empire from within understood something their oppressors never grasped. That true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect what matters most. Their legacy lives on, not just in the military victories they enabled, but in the proof they provided that courage, intelligence, and moral purpose will always triumph over brute force and ideological hatred. The flames they lit in those ammunition depots burned far longer than the explosions themselves. They burned through the darkness of occupation, through the silence of official neglect, and through the decades of historical amnesia that followed. Today, those flames still burn in the memories of survivors, in the research of historians, and in the inspiration they provide to anyone who faces seemingly impossible odds. They were the women who refused to be invisible when invisibility meant complicity. They were the mothers, daughters, wives, and sisters who chose to fight when fighting seemed futile. They were the ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world needed heroes most. They were the women who burned the empire, and in doing so, they lit the way to freedom for us all.